Okay, we're jumping right in. Lesson number 1, wrestling with faith. Faith is one of the most powerful attributes an individual can cultivate for themselves. If we want to be powerful people, if we want to feel the ability to go beyond, we need to cultivate faith. The challenge, as we probably all know this, the challenge is that having faith is actually frightening. It's actually frightening because it means letting go and putting our trust in something else. What is that something? Who is that something? Can we? It's very, very difficult. And that's why we're getting together tonight, because I would say that every single one of us equally, maybe in different ways and on different levels, but every single one of us equally wrestles with faith. And I would hope, actually, that there isn't a single moment in any of our lives where we stop wrestling with faith. Because wrestling with faith is so important. That's how we grow with the faith that we have. And so here's the goal that I have for all of us. Okay, this is my goal. And I want to be very clear about this. And I want you to also be very clear about this. My goal is that you understand everything that I share with you. My goal is not that you agree necessarily with everything I share with you. That I'm going to leave to you to decide. But my goal is that everyone understand what I'm sharing. So you say, oh, I understand that. Maybe you don't want it. Maybe you're not going to own that, but you understand it. That's what I would like to accomplish. Okay? So that's our goal. Your goal should be to understand what we're learning. Once you understand it, you will know whether you're going to actually take that into your life and agree with it or not. And I'd like to begin with a story, and this story is just a way of entering into understanding who this course is for. So at the end of the story, I'm expecting half of the class to leave. No, I'm just kidding. But for you to understand where we're going with this course is really the intention. So there was a great Hasidic mystic, a great Hasidic master, okay, a very spiritually connected individual who is known as the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Chabad Rebbe. Okay, don't worry about all of that. And he had many, many followers. And one day a follower came to him with a problem, as many of his followers would do. When they had problems, they would consult with him. And the Rebbe said, what's bothering you? And he said, you know, Rebbe, I'm really disturbed because my mind wanders. Here's a man, if you would see him, you would think, oh, this guy is like religious, like unbelievably religious. And he says, my mind wanders, and I sometimes wonder whether there really is a creator. So the Rebbe looks at him. This is about maybe 150 years ago in Russia. The Rebbe looks at him and he says, "Nu." You know that Jewish word, "nu"? It answers 98% of the questions. "Nu." So the followers, what do you mean "nu"? I just dumped a serious load. Something's really bothering me. So he thought that the Rebbe didn't understand what he said. So he repeats himself. I really am, sometimes my mind wonders whether there is actually a God. And the Rebbe again says, "Nu." So the Rebbe looks at him and sees he's not getting the conversation. And the Rebbe wasn't really saying that much. So he tells him, "Can I ask you a question? Why are you bothered by the fact that sometimes your mind wonders whether there's a God? So there's no God. Why are you bothered?" He says, "Rebbe, what do you mean? I'm a Jew." And the Rebbe said, if that's the case, everything is totally fine. And this is what the Rebbe was trying to convey to him, which I would like to convey to all of us. And that is that when a person wrestles with faith, what does that tell you? That there's some deep part of them that knows there's a God, that believes there's a God, and therefore they're disturbed when there's another part of them that's trying to tell them that there isn't a God. If the person wasn't in conflict because the mind says there's no God and there's no No God, no God. What's the problem? But this man conveyed, I'm a Jew. And so he himself understood that there's a part of him that knows there is a God, but yet there's a part of him that doesn't. And the Rebbe wanted him to be aware of this, that even though you have a conflict, and that conflict needs to be resolved, but I also want you to understand that there isn't only the doubt in you, there's that absolute clarity in you as well, which is the whole reason why you have the question. In other words, a question is a symptom of a belief. You ever hear someone say that they're angry at God? That's a pretty good sign. Someone who is clear that there's no God doesn't get angry at God. God, how do you get angry at God? There is no God. So this is all an indication that there is a God. The question is how we deal with this entity of God when we have all of the different questions or different obstacles that we're going to discuss in this class as we go through it. You know, if you walk into a church on a Sunday morning, I'm not recommending that you do, I'm just saying that if you would, theoretically, you would stop someone and say, ma'am, do you believe in God? What do you think she would say? Why do you think I'm here? Of course I believe in God. What type of question is that? Right? You ask a gentleman, do you believe in God? Of course. You think I get up early Sunday morning to come out here because I don't believe in God? Of course I believe in God. You go into a mosque, right? You ask a gentleman, you believe in God? You better believe I believe in God. That's why I come to pray 5 times a day. But here's a funny thing. If you come into a synagogue on Yom Kippur, and you go over to a Jew, and you ask him, do you believe in God? You know what many of us say? What do many of us say? God. I'm not sure what God is. I don't know what he looks like. I never met him. I don't know if I believe in God. Stop bothering me with such complicated questions. Right? That's what happens that's what you get from a Jew, right? So you ask the Jew the reverse. So what are you doing here? And you know what the Jew says? What do you mean? I'm a Jew and it's Yom Kippur. And that's the beauty. That is the beauty. Because that says that with all of my mind's questions, which any thinking mind will have, there is also a deep clarity that's there at the same time. And so our course is not here to prove the existence of God. We will not be discussing that. We are assuming that we all believe that there is a God. But we are also assuming that every single one of us, beginning with myself, is challenged by this entity of God, has a lot of questions and obstacles in life that block us from really embracing that fully and gaining all of the benefit that we can benefit from when we have faith in God. So what we're going to be addressing people who want to believe but have questions. How many of you would say, I want to believe and I have questions? I'll be the first one to put up my hand. You know why? Because the more you study and the more answers you have, what happens? The more questions you have, right? So I hope you have questions and wish to strengthen, be more comfortable with your belief. So many people have told me in my aggressively inviting people to this course. And I'm so happy you're still all talking to me. So they said, you know, Rabbi, I don't wrestle with faith. I'm good. You know, I believe in God and it's all good. Right? If someone were to tell you that I'm married for 20 years, not a single issue, never a fight, never a disagreement, cool as a feather. I wouldn't believe a single person that tells me that. You just have to be married for a couple of days, and you know, right? Right? That's an impossibility. You know why? Because when we're in a relationship with another entity, they are different. And we need to struggle to develop that relationship. That is the fortunate or unfortunate reality, however we would like to describe it. And therefore, if we are not wrestling with our faith, I would take you and throw you into the ring and say, you better start wrestling. Because when we wrestle, that's how we cultivate our faith, and that's how we strengthen so we can be more comfortable. And if there are questions we're going to have tonight that you say don't bother you, which is fine. You don't need to be bothered by every question. But just ask yourself, if your child were to ask you that question, you would start really thinking about it then. I hope. And what would you say then? And so we need to wrestle with our faith. And that's exactly what we're here to do. Okay, we're good so far? Any rebuttals yet? Did I say anything that really offended someone? All right, we're doing well so far. Fantastic. Okay, so we're going to begin now getting into the meat of tonight's lesson, and we're going to begin by discussing the blockages that we have to faith in God. Okay, the blockages that we have, and I need you for this. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to do this: to go to page number 2, where you have exercise number 1. And I'm going to say this, as I always do. The more you engage in the class, the more you're going to get out of the class. The more you sit back with your hands folded, the less you get out of the class. That's the reality. Okay? So exercise number 1, if you have a pen, you can write it down. If not, just use your mind to think. If you have someone next to you, you can tell it them, which would be even better. Okay, what are some issues that commonly challenge a person's faith in God and their desire to have a relationship with Him? What is a blockage that gets in people's way of having a relationship with God? I just want to tell you I'm a little bit concerned tonight because it looks like Rabbi Shem Tov's taking the class. Now we're all in trouble. Okay, so come up with a couple of things, 2 or 3 things that are obstacles that get in the way of our relationship with God. Many people will say there's no evidence of a God. It's not rational to have faith in God. God isn't noticeable or present in my life. Some God, but God is completely irrelevant. Why do people suffer? There's so much unspeakable evil in the world. Why is God such a petty, jealous, and judgmental God? Why do I need Him? Okay, so He's there. It was nice knowing you, God. No, done. Why do I need God? And why does my life have to be made difficult with all of the rules that God throws into life? Okay, so I want to show you a short clip of a comedian, George Carlin, and some of you are going to be offended, okay? I'm warning you. I figured let him offend you instead of me, okay? And some of you are going to laugh. And whatever you choose to feel is totally fine, but it brings out a point nonetheless. So here we go.
Think about it. Religion has actually convinced people that there's an invisible man living in the sky who watches everything you do every minute of every day. And the invisible man has a special list of 10 things he does not want you to do. And if you do any of these 10 things, he has a special place full of fire and smoke and burning and torture and anguish where he will send you to live and suffer and burn and choke and scream and cry forever and ever till the end of time. But he loves you. He loves you. He loves you and he needs money. He always needs money. He's all powerful, all perfect, all knowing, and all wise. Somehow, just can't handle money.
It was definitely funny, right? Maybe a little offensive, but very funny. But he raises actually some very good points. And can we say that his questions that he raises, maybe in a more offensive way, is not our question, right? Who wants a God that has this whole downstairs department, right? And what's the whole deal with a rabbi asking me for money, right? I can't set up meetings with people because they think I'm asking them for money. I can't even say hello. That's how serious this problem is, right? So we're going to try and be as open as possible here. So maybe the solution is, with this challenging entity called God, maybe the solution is no God. Maybe we should just opt out from God, right? If we want to be wide open about this, okay? Let's just consider that for a second. Well, obviously, that's a little bit of a problem. So if you go to a question for discussion on page number 3, how important is God to Judaism? Maybe we can just be good people, right? Which a lot of times we wish we could just be. Why can't I just be a good person? So the reality is this. The basics of Judaism, right, insist on God. In fact, we probably are familiar with he spoke about his 10 rules. You know the first rule of the 10 rules, the first of the 10 commandments is, the first thing God told the Jews, I am God, you're God. Right? That was very important. That it's very fundamentally important that we believe that there is a God. And you know what the second one is? There shall be no other gods. I'm the God, there are no other gods. So it's very clear that God is of paramount importance to Judaism. And it's of paramount importance that we as Jews deal with God as opposed to just saying, I'm going to be a good person, because clearly, from God's perspective, no surprise, but from the Jewish perspective, God is very, very important. And I hope that through even tonight's lesson, we're going to see in some way, in some challenging way, but in some way how important God's presence is in every one of our lives. But we're going to start with a book called Sefer HaChinuch. It's a medieval work, and we actually study this during daylight saving time through the summer, every Shabbos afternoon here, this very book. And he accounts for the 613 commandments, and he explains all of the 613 commandments. And here's what he explains about the commandment to believe in God. So we're going to go to text number 1. Hold down the left. It's on? Okay, fantastic. And I just want to mention, the readings, we pass around the mic. If you don't want to read, just pass it on to the person next to you. It's really no big deal.
The mitzvah to believe in God consists of the obligation to believe that the world has one God. The origins of this mitzvah are obvious. All know that this belief is the foundation of Judaism, and that one who rejects it is in denial of the most fundamental principle and has no share in and merit with Israel. This mitzvah requires us to affix in our soul the truth of God's existence and the impossibility of any other option. If asked about our belief, we will affirm to any inquirer that the belief in one God is our heart's conviction. We will never submit to a contrary belief, even at the cost of our lives.
Okay. So this is pretty serious. This is an all or nothing deal, as he explains it, that we must believe in God. Now, sometimes when we hear commandments, we feel like it's like this, like the God that the comedian was describing, this top-down controller that says, you better believe in me because I need people to believe in me, right? But wouldn't it be beautiful if we actually realized that this is the biggest favor for us, that this serves us so well? That's where we want to get to. That's actually where we want to get to. So we're going to explore why believing in God is actually not optional, but for a very good reason. Okay? That's what we hope to get to in a general sense by the end of tonight's discussion. What's the problem? We want to have faith, but we have these blockages. We have all these different blockages that get in our way. So I want to ask you a question. Okay, you ready for an interesting question? Do you believe in Banaradas? Let me repeat. Do you believe in Banaradas? Raise your hand if you believe in Banaradas. Does anyone believe in Banaradas? No one. Fantastic, Stella. I am so happy that you don't believe in something you don't know. Because imagine if you believed in something you don't know. That would be ridiculous, right? So I'd like to ask everyone here another question. Okay? Anyone here have a degree in the subject of God? I'm sure we have doctors, lawyers, all different types of occupations in the room, spent 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, 8 years in college. No one has a degree in God. Rabbi Shem Tov does. Thank God, we are saved. I happen to know he spent a lot of time and continues to studying about God. He actually does. That's what we do in the Chabad Yeshiva, actually. We spend a lot of time studying about God. Right, but it's very rare for someone to be studying about God. You have to be like a strange person, like, that looks like me in order to do something like that. But otherwise, average people don't do that. And how do we know if we believe in something or don't believe in something if we don't even know what it is entirely? Of course, we know something about God, but entirely about God. It's really important for us to investigate what God is. Now, we can be very oversimplistic about it, but God is not simplistic at all. So we can't be oversimplistic about it. So here's what we're going to do to create a contrast for ourselves. Okay? In exercise number 2, which adjectives or qualities describe God? Which adjectives or qualities do not describe God? You're not showing this to me or to anyone. It's just for you to write down how you describe God, what God is and what God isn't. And it's worthwhile for you to do this because it'll help you see where you've gotten as we move on in the class. Okay? What is God? Someone asks you, your grandchild asks you, what is God? Okay? You're having a philosophical question with your friend over coffee. What would you say God is? Let's move on now. And hopefully we're going to be able to update our God file in our brain. Okay? Just a little bit. Some of us, may have a very good concept, but we want to get to a deeper concept. Okay? Deeper concepts that we're getting out of whatever mold and impression of God we have in our head. And we're going to... How many of you heard of Maimonides? Okay, so Maimonides was a doctor, philosopher. He was actually a mystic as well, a great authority on Jewish law. And he wrote a great work on Jewish law, which we actually study every single day. And in his book of Jewish law, he writes about God, which is really interesting. Not just in his philosophy books, but in a book of law, he discusses God and what the precise nature of God is. Why do you think God does that? Because if you want to believe in God, which is a commandment, you got to know what God is. That's why he explains the nature of God. See, here's what we're going to do for text 2a. It's a long reading, and I'm going to have every person read one paragraph. I may do some explaining in between each paragraph, and we pass the mic down for each paragraph. Is that okay? Microphone's on? Okay, so let's go to page 5, text 2a.
The foundation of all foundations and the pillar of all wisdom is to know that there is a primary being who brings all things into being. All that exists in the heavens, the earth, and what is between them came into existence only from the truth of his being. Great.
Okay, so I just want to interject here and say, there's the great question, right? There's a great question about where everything comes from. And with all of the theories of how things came to be, where did the first thing come from? And this is exactly what Maimonides is talking about. That first thing, which is the source of everything, is what we call God. And if you want, you can call that thing whatever you'd like. Primary force, first being, it's all good. God is just the common, overused word. That's what Maimonides is saying. All that exists in the heavens and the earth, what is between them, came into existence only from the truth of his being. Let's continue.
In theory, if he does not exist, no other thing could possibly exist.
Let me explain. When one entity is the cause and the source of another entity, this entity depends on where it comes from. I'll give you a very practical example you'll be able to relate to. You have a kid in college, and he gets his money from you. And he runs out of money. What does he do? He calls you. I don't have money. Right? Why? Because he depends on you for money. And if you don't send him money, he doesn't have it. That's dependency. And what Maimonides is explaining is that when there is a source, which there must be, to everything that exists, everything depends on that entity. So if that entity will not be, then nothing will be. Okay, we're becoming philosophers here. It's really nice. Let's continue.
In theory, if all things aside from him would not exist, he would continue to exist. He would not cease to exist because all else ceases to exist. For all things need him, but he does not need any of them. His truth, therefore, does not resemble the truth of any other being.
So let me explain. Therefore, God is independent. And you and I'm sorry to say this, I know we're all self-made great Americans, but you and I are very dependent. So therefore, God exists despite anything, and we are entirely dependent. Let's go to the next paragraph.
This is implied by the prophet's statement, God, the Lord, is true. He alone is true, and no other entity compares to his truth. This is the meaning of the Torah's statement, there is none beside him. Outside of him, there is no comparable true existence.
Okay, what does this mean? So some of you have heard me explain this before. What is the definition of the word that we all know and we all use all the time? True. But it's true. What does true mean? True, in its purest sense, means absolute, unconditional. Therefore, it is true. If 2 plus 2 only equals 4 on Wednesdays, then saying 2 plus 2 equals 4 is no longer true. But if 2 plus 2 equals 4 all 7 days of the week, 24 hours a day, whether it's 1981 or it's the year 18, then it is true. It is independently true. It's absolute. That's what we mean when we say God is true, because God is truly true, because God is truly independent. Okay, let's continue. Go ahead.
This being is the God of the world, the master of the entire earth. Knowing all this is a mitzvah, as it says, I am the Lord your God. It is forbidden to presume that there is another God beside this being, as it says, you shall have no other God before me.
Continue, yeah.
Moreover, belief in another God is a denial of a fundamental principle of the Jewish faith. For belief in our God is the great principle upon which all of Judaism rests. Excellent.
You see, if there was another God, God doesn't have an issue with competition. God said, you want there to be other gods? You know, in theory, we can make believe there are other gods. But that would defy what God is. If there is another God, then God is not independent anymore and the source of everything. There are two entities. So the definition of God means that there cannot be other gods. It's not a competition game, a jealous game. Oh, we're getting offended because you have a different God. It defies the very definition of God. Let's continue.
This God is one, not two or more, but one. His unity surpasses any unity present in the things of the world. His unity is not like that of a single species that comprises many members, nor like a single body that contains various parts and dimensions. There exists in this world no unity similar to God's unity. Knowing all this is a mitzvah, as it says, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one.
So Maimonides is explaining that God is the truest meaning of oneness, which means complete unity, which is the entity behind and the source of everything. And I'm going to leave it at that for now. That's all we need to know for tonight. Let's continue.
It is explicitly stated in the Torah and the works of the prophets that God is not a body or physical form. It says, For your God is the Lord in the heavens above and the earth below, and a body cannot simultaneously exist in two places. It is also stated, For you did not see any image on the day that God spoke to you at Horeb from the midst of the fire. Further it is said, To whom will you compare me? Who is my equal? Were he a body, however, he would be comparable to other bodies.
Okay, so what does that tell us? Where are you right now? In a general sense, you're in this room, which means you're not in every other place in the universe. Wow. You are so pathetically limited. You're in just one place at one time. Unbelievable, right? But that's the way we are because we're very limited beings. The only being that is unlimited is God, who is everywhere, always. How many of you feel that you're beginning to hear which you may have heard in the past, but you're beginning to hear a depth of this entity we call God. Okay? A depth. Okay, about 4 or 5 of us. Okay, that's a good start. I know Jews have a hard time picking up their hands. That's okay. So what we learned now is that there are 2 mitzvos. There is the mitzvah to believe in God, and there is the commandment to believe in His unity, in His oneness. And now Rambam adds one more thing, which we're going to read in text 2b, and that is regarding anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism is the fact that the Torah refers to God in human-like language. So we speak about God's arm and God's hand and God's anger and all of these things. What does all of this mean if God defies limit and body and human characteristics? So let's read text 2b.
Because it has been established that He does not have a body or corporeal form, it is clear that He is not subject to any properties or incidents that characterize the physical, neither integration nor disintegration, space nor measure, ascent nor descent, right nor left, front nor back, standing nor sitting. He is not subject to time, so He does not have a beginning, end, or an age. He does not change, for there is nothing that can cause Him to change. Death, life, in the context of physical life, foolishness, wisdom, in terms of human wisdom, sleep, waking, anger, laughter, joy, sadness, silence, and speech, in the human understanding of speech, are not applicable to Him.
Wow. So let's go to exercise number 3, okay? And based on what we just learned, according to Maimonides, which adjectives or qualities describe God and which adjectives or qualities do not describe God? Can we say that God's funny? No. Can we say that God's smart? No. Can we say that God is big? No. These are all limited definitions, and God is unlimited, which really makes it very difficult to say what God is. What is God not? Whoa, the list doesn't stop, right? God isn't smart. God isn't funny. It doesn't sound like a good resume, but it's actually coming from an unbelievable place, an unlimited place, so therefore God is not limited to any particular thing. So if we look up, So we believe that there is an underlying fundamental reality which is the cause of everything into existence, which is what we call God. We believe that everything that exists is a product of this fundamental reality. What does reality mean? What's the root of reality? Real, right? God is the most real entity that there is because God is independent, which makes something very, very real. The fundamental reality, is essential. And that means absolutely necessary, is unchanging. God doesn't change. God's not moody, which maybe is why some people like to adopt a godlike complex. But God, no moods, no changes. God is one, is bodiless and formless. I think that is it, yeah. Let's read text number 3, which was a beautiful poem that was written explaining how the only way we can truly define God is by saying what God is not by saying what God is. Let's read text number 3. Whoever has the microphone. Go ahead.
It's on.
Yeah. It's on.
The ultimate knowledge of you is the knowledge that we cannot know you. Our philosophic exertion is inquiry is only to know that you exist. Only the comprehension through knowledgeable of what you are not, draped with righteousness, the seeker in your sanctuary, by appreciation distance, a person can approach and bow to you.
Okay. So I want to share a story with you that some of you may have heard. It's a story told with another great Hasidic mystic and master, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev. Some of you know exactly where Berditchev is, and many of us have no idea where it is, other than somewhere in Ukraine or Russia or somewhere, right? So Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev, in his town, there was a glorified atheist. I say he's a glorified atheist because he would walk down the street and he saw it as his mission to convince everyone that there's no God. So if you met him on the street, you knew to cross the street, otherwise you got a whole speech about how there's no God. And one day Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Berditchev himself is walking down the street, and this atheist comes, oh, Rabbi! If you get the rabbi, you get the whole town, right? So he figures, I got to catch this guy. So he starts preaching to him how there's no God, and the proofs and the evidence, and how foolish it is, naive, and the whole 9 yards. And Rabbi Levi Yitzchak looks at him and he says, you know, we have far more in common than you actually realize. Because the God you don't believe in, I don't believe in either. Do you understand what he was telling him? If I thought God was what you think God is, I would never believe in such a God. That's the reason why it's so important for us to understand in some significant way what God is, because then we can actually begin to approach this whole discussion of faith in God. Today, possibly more than ever, in the last maybe a couple of hundred years, after the Enlightenment movement, the world believes less and less in God. It is actually trendier to be an atheist in many respects today than it is to believe in God. The question is, who is this God that people who say, I don't believe in God, don't believe in? Is it the same God that we're learning about tonight? That's what we wanted to discuss. And another point is this. What we're going to realize, as I mentioned earlier, is we're going to realize that the God people don't believe in is the God that they project certain attributes on. And therefore they say, I can't believe in a God like that. And thank God they can't believe in a God like that. I would hate if they would believe in a God like that. There are two issues, two types of reasons or blockages that we have when it comes to belief in God. One are issues that deal with God's very existence, and the other are what we're going to call packaging issues. Okay? That's stuff that comes along with the package, you know? So you get married, beautiful person, but there are some things that come along with them, right? So there's God, and then there are things that come along with God. Most people who have an issue with faith in God, the fundamental faith about I can't believe in God, they are usually dealing with packaging issues. But almost everyone, polls demonstrate this, as we'll read in a minute, almost everyone, when it comes to just the notion of the existence of a primal being, that's the source of everything, most people actually believe in God. And that's what we want to bring out here, that the essence of God is an infinite entity. That's simple, an infinite entity. And if we understand that, it's relatively easy to actually believe in God. You ever look at a couple? You ever look at a couple? You see a couple walking down the street, and you just wonder, how did she marry him? I knew it. They say the best jokes are the true ones, right? I'm not the only one who thinks that sometimes, right? Like, for whatever reason we make that judgment. I'm not sure exactly where it comes from. Every time it's something else, but somehow you just think that this isn't a match, right? So how, in fact, did she marry him? Come to think of it, how did she? Probably because even if she had the same judgments you have on him, right? Even if she did, after a few dates, began to actually see who this person is and not just the package. And when we pay attention to what God is, and we don't get caught up in the package, which we're going to deal with, by the way, we're going to deal with the packaging, because we have to. Those are the real issues. But we'll begin to see that God is not a problem. It's the packaging that God comes with which raises a lot of problems. Granted, that's 100% true. Let's read text number 5.
Previous Pew Research Center studies have shown that the share of Americans who believe in God with absolute certainty has declined in recent years, while the share saying they have doubts about God's existence or that they do not believe in God at all has grown. These trends raise a series of questions. When respondents say they don't believe in God, what are they rejecting? Are they rejecting belief in any higher power or spiritual force in the universe? Or are they rejecting only the traditional Christian idea of God, perhaps recalling images of a bearded man in the sky? Conversely, when respondents say they do believe in God, what do they believe in? God is described in the Bible or some other spiritual force or supreme being?
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, continue. Yeah.
A new Pew Research Center survey of more than 4,700 U.S. adults finds that 1/3 of Americans say they do not believe in the God of the Bible, but that they do believe there is some other higher power or spiritual force in the universe. A slim majority of Americans, 56%, say they believe in God as described in the Bible, and 1 in 10 do not believe in any other higher power or spiritual force. In the U.S., belief in a deity is common even among the religiously unaffiliated, a group composed of those who identify themselves religiously as atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular, and sometimes referred to collectively as religious knowns. Indeed, nearly 3/4 of religious knowns, 72%, believe in a higher power of some kind, even if not in God as described in the Bible.
So this is really insightful and fascinating, just in observation of our society. This actually means that people have a problem with the Bible God. Because when people read the Bible, they read about a God who's killing, who's angry, who's judging, who's punishing, who's restricting, and all of these different things. And that's really the issue that people have with God. But the fact that there is an entity that is the source of everything, that actually 9 out of 10 people believe in. So actually, most people believe in God. And I'm saying, the reason why I'm sharing this is for us to understand that faith in God as a starter is simply getting away from the packaging and realizing we actually have faith in God. Like the guy in the beginning of the story, in the beginning of the class, right? Who comes to the Rebbe and says, I question whether there's a God. And the Rebbe is trying to reveal to him that while your mind has all these different issues, in your soul, you know that there is a God. Because the essence of what God is what almost every person acknowledges. Not only that, here's something super fascinating. You want to hear something super fascinating? Scientists are actually, prominent leading scientists actually are beginning to express this very notion. The difference between the essential God, if you will, and the packaging that God comes with. Okay, so there's a very prominent British scientist and mathematician by the name of Dusatoy, or something like that it's pronounced, and he actually filled the seat of Richard Dawkins at Oxford University. So he's from the leading scientists today, and he shares something in text 6a, which to me is absolutely fascinating. More than fascinating, I would say it's unbelievably honest. Which, and I'm not saying that, I'm not trying to imply that people are dishonest, but raw honesty, it's very hard for any of us to just stand up and face, especially something which is extremely unpopular in our circle. And that's what he does in this text. Let's read text 6a. Go ahead.
What happens if I try to be creative with some of our knowledgeable questions? What if, for example, I were to define God as the solution to the question, why some things rather than nothing? This concept is meant to be nothing more than the solution to the question. It doesn't have any other properties. Even if we gain more knowledge about the answer to the question, it will just mean that we know more about the particular God.
Let me interject for a second, because I suspect we may have lost a few people here, okay? Because I would have been lost if I didn't read this a few times. Why something rather than nothing? How many of you lose sleep over this question every night? Why something rather than nothing? Oh my gosh, right? The question is, it is a philosophical question, and it's a... that people that is asked in metaphysics and all of these more abstract studies. And the question simply is, why is it that we have a world full of matter, of something, of existing things? Why is there just nothing? What is compelling everything to be? Okay, that's the question. And whether that keeps you up at night or not, and I hope it doesn't, that is the question. And what this scientist is saying is, we don't have an answer to that question, but maybe he's saying, maybe Dussatoy is saying that we should consider that there is an entity that is above everything that causes something to be out of nothing, which is what people refer to as God. That's basically what he's saying. Let's continue.
The trouble with most religions is that the God that is served has so many properties that have nothing to do with the definition. It's as if we're working backwards, focusing on the strange properties conjured up over the generations without really understanding the original definition. We come across this bastardized picture early on as kids, and then when we ask the question, why something rather than nothing, it doesn't really work as a solution, but we've been shown the wrong thing.
Continue, yeah.
Being an atheist means, for me, that I reject the classical solutions that religion seems to offer for these unknowns. But maybe I shouldn't throw everything out. There are things that will always remain unknown, so perhaps God does exist. I wonder, though, whether as I come to the end of my exploration, I have changed my mind about declaring myself an atheist. With my definition of a God as that which we cannot know, to declare myself an atheist would mean that I believe there is nothing we cannot know. I don't believe that anymore. In some sense, I think I have proved that this God does exist. The challenge now is to explore what quality this God has.
What this scientist is doing is simply saying, the packaging that we're taught as kids doesn't work for me. That's all, in his opinion, it's all nonsense. We'll deal with that later, but in his opinion, it's all nonsense. That's what gets in his way of believing in God. But the fact that there is a primal source, that God answers a big question. Why is there something and not nothing? And that works for me. That's exactly what he's saying. Demonstrating that even the greatest of minds actually can relate to a God that is an infinite being, without all of the other stuff that God that is attached to God. Simply the fact that God is an infinite being. That God is not limited or defined, and that God is not human-like. So the idea that God rewards, that God punishes, that God doesn't want me to eat this cheeseburger, all of those nuisances or things that we don't like, that's all packaging. And while some of that is true, some of that isn't, we need to deal with that. Those are issues. But the fact that there's an infinite entity, that's not the issue. Our challenges don't come from the essence of God, it comes from the packaging. Now, there are two types of packaging. There is fake news packaging, right? There's fake news packaging. There's just ridiculous stuff we believe about God because someone decided to say something to us when we were kids, and we believe it. What do we have to do with fake news? A major file delete. Okay, that's what we need to do with that. Right? So we need to learn that these things simply aren't true. And then there is real news packaging, which is challenging. And we need to have a better perspective and understanding on that packaging, because when we understand something differently, we experience it very differently. And when something is a challenge, and I will tell you that I have challenges with a lot of the packaging. But I feel also that when I have challenges with the packaging, it's my issue. It's not the packaging's issue. That means I have to work in understanding that packaging a little better. There are two approaches we can always take to a problem, right? When my spouse says something which is utterly ridiculous, right? Because only spouses know how to do that, right? So is it because they are utterly ridiculous, or is it because I don't understand where they're coming from? Two perspectives. I'm not going to ask you what your spouse's perspective is on you, but when we change from you're ridiculous to I have to understand this a little better, or I can't relate to where you're coming from because I'm male gender, or I raised with different experiences, that changes our entire attitude to what's going on. And that's the way we need to be with packaging too. But we're going to deal with a lot of those packaging issues that we all have. And I would say that we share most of them. Okay? If someone sees a child suffering and is not deeply disturbed, there's a serious problem. Okay, now at the same time, we can have God, a perspective on God in that, but we all are challenged by the very same things. Okay, let's now, well, here you have, just a moment. There's the two types of packaging, the childish understanding, which we simply need to upgrade, and then there's the not essential but true packaging that we really need to have a different perspective on because they are an impediment to our faith in God. They challenge our faith in God. Okay, so let's talk about, we're going to talk, you see, we have a little problem now. The problem is that if God is this infinite, endless, undefinable being, how close do you feel to this entity? You can't even describe it, right? So how close do you feel to it? It's completely abstract, irrelevant, disconnected from me, right? That's the problem we just created. So we're going to understand another profound idea over here, okay? And that is understanding this problem. The question of why is there something and not nothing? But if God is only the solution to why something rather than nothing, he is very great and he's irrelevant to my actions. That's a problem because from the God that we are taught about, God is not irrelevant at all. And Dussatoy actually expresses this in his own words. I'm going to read this text 6b. And he says the trouble with this definition of God is, his definition that he's willing to accept, is that it doesn't really get you much further. Defining something as a solution to why something rather than nothing doesn't give rise to anything new. You need to make up properties for this thing that don't follow from its definition. As Karen Armstrong put it, this high God is too high. I reject the existence of a supernatural intelligence that intervenes in the evolution of the universe and in our lives. I reject a God that intervenes, so I'm good with this God which is abstract, but that means that this God which is abstract is completely disconnected from me. This is a rejection of the God that people assign strange properties to, such as compassion, wisdom, and love, that make no sense when it comes to the idea that I'm exploring. So what he's essentially saying is that while I'm willing to accept this abstract, distant God, but guess what? What are we left with? We're left with an irrelevant God. So who needs a God like that anyway? See, here's a profound thing. Who was the first Jew? Abraham. What was Abraham called? Avraham Ha'ivri. Right? There are many people in this room who used to, maybe you still have it somewhere locked up, have a passport that was stamped Ivrei. Avram Ha'ivri. You know what Ivri means? The other side. Abraham from the other side. Why was Abraham called Abraham from the other side? Because Abraham, the whole world was on one side, and he was on the other side. He was born into a world where there was a God that everyone believed in, right? God, everyone believed in God, but God was irrelevant. Just like Dussatoy explained, God was irrelevant. So what did they do? They created very relevant gods. The sun that gives us warmth, pray to that. The moon, the clouds, idols. They even turned people into gods. Right? A man by the name of Nimrod, who we're going to read about in the Torah in the next few weeks. Pharaoh thought he was a god because they were looking for a relevant God when the essential God was irrelevant. The commandment to believe in God is one. God is and God is one. Abraham's generation believed that God is, but they didn't believe that God is one, that God is integrated with everything, that God is the source of everything, that God is the reality of everything. Because they only understood that there's this infinite being, and this infinite being we can't even define, and therefore is completely disconnected from us. This is the world that Abraham came into. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, so what's the problem? Is God good? Is God a good thing? You can never have too much of a good thing. Why don't we make a lot of gods? Why did Abraham, in fact, object to many, many gods? What was the problem with, why don't we have many gods like all of the people in his generation had? And why did the people in his generation object to Abraham to the point that they almost killed him? And why was everyone opposed to it? And they said, no, there can't be one God. There must be many gods. And the answer is the difference between God being relevant and irrelevant. Let me explain. Okay, I'm going to do my best to explain. Okay. Abraham came to the awareness that when God is this unbelievable, infinite being, that does not make God irrelevant. That actually gives God the ability more than anything else to be as relevant as God wants to be. The others believed that when God is this infinite being, God becomes irrelevant, and therefore we need other relevant gods. And here's the reason why. You ever have in school, you ever have an absent-minded professor? You ever hear the term absent-minded professor? Why do they call professors absent-minded? Why don't they call doctors absent-minded? Why are professors absent-minded? Because professors are known to be living in a heady theoretical place, where they're thinking all of the time. And therefore they lose touch with reality. And therefore they are abstract thinkers. So therefore they're absent-minded. They lose touch with reality. And that's in fact why people who think a lot are often not in touch with what's going on around them. If you're here, you can't be here. If you're grounded, you can't be up there. And the way people understood God is this unbelievable thing that's up there, and therefore he can't be here. So here I'm going to attempt to explain something a little bit complex. When we say that God is infinite, that God is endless, as God is not limited, that means that God is not limited by being stuck in heaven, and God is not limited by coming down to earth. God is engaged with everything. When something is great, it's not small. When something is small, it's not great. But God isn't great. God is greater than great. God doesn't have any definition and can engage with everything. See, here's a little conversation that Abraham had with the people during his time. Okay? Little conversation. And you let me know if this makes any sense to you. Okay, just a moment here. We're going to jump. Abraham tells the people in his time, there's only one invisible God. That's all that there is, one invisible God. Only one power who controls all that is in heaven and earth. There's no point in worshiping or ascribing power to anything other than him. That's what Abraham tells the people. Right? What do the people say? You disrespect God. How can you talk like that about God? God can't be too great if he cares about and watches over little me. How great is God if he's paying attention to me? God is so great and powerful that he created a hierarchy of executives, middle managers, and paper pushers to take care of the details. And God remains transcendent. That was their argument back. If God is really great, God doesn't deal with petty stuff. Do CEOs take care of the little stuff in the company? No, someone else does. They're busy being CEO. They're busy being great. So how can God think about me if God is great? That was their argument back to Abraham. So what does Abraham say to them? You're right, my friend. My God isn't great. Great is a box. Do you know that? That means you're great and you're not great. Smart is a box. It means you're smart and you're not smart. Strong is a box. It means you're strong and you're not weak. It actually is a limit. It's a beneficial limit in most cases, but it is still a definition. And any definition is a limitation. So Abraham says, God is great, not my God. My God isn't great. Great is just a definition that God created. That's a creation of God's. That's not God. That would be ridiculous. My God is beyond great and beyond any other definition your mind can conjure. In your box, everything has to be on a scale. This is here and this is here. God's up there, I'm down here. Everything is measurable. Everything's on the spectrum. And those that are higher up on the scale don't relate to those lower than them. But God isn't in your box. That's your box of measuring things. That's our box as humans of measuring things. He is above the scale. The highest level on the scale, heaven, and the lowest level, earth, are the same to him. Heaven is transcendent, and God is beyond the transcendent. God isn't transcendent, God is beyond. That's the reason why it is not accurate to say that God is spiritual. Because spiritual is a definition. Only in our box do we see spiritual as more elevated than physical. But that's not inherently true. They are both simply definitions. I'm going to ask you a question we had in the last course, for some of you who are in the last course. What is closer to infinity? Any mathematicians in the room? What's closer to infinity? 1,000,000 or 1? What's closer to infinity? 1,000,000 or 1? How many of you think 1,000,000 is closer to infinity? Raise your hand. How many of you think 1 is closer to infinity? Raise your hand. How many of you think they are equidistant from infinity? Wow, we got a brilliant class, right? 1 and 1,000,000 is the same to infinite. They are equally, infinitely distant from infinity. I know this is a little bit philosophical, but we need to understand this to understand that God is above and therefore engaged with everything. When you are truly above everything, you are integrated with everything. When you are here, then you're not here. And so Abraham came and introduced the world to monotheism. To say that there is one God. You know what one God means? Not that there is one God and not 20 gods. That God is one and everything. God is the backdrop, the reality upon which all happens. That is monotheism. When we say, here, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, hear Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, we are saying something far more profound than there is one God. We're saying there is one reality within which everything else is happening. And if that reality were to theoretically not be, nothing would be. That is what puts into existence everything. How are we doing? Okay, I know this is challenging. As long as you're somewhat with me, we're good, because it takes time to digest these things. Here, I'm going to show this to you in a verse in the Torah, okay? We're going to go to a verse in the Torah. We're going to back up slightly, and we're going to go to text 8a. And I'm sorry that I'm dominating the readings here, but I'm going to do that. So there's a reading here from Psalms, which says, "From where the sun rises to where it sets, God's name is praised." Everywhere God's name is praised. God is exalted above all the nations. His glory is upon the heavens. What is this verse saying? Where is God? In the heavens. His glory is upon the heavens. Right? God is exalted above all nations, meaning that all nations see God as being in the heavens. Who is like our God, King David says, who is seated on high, who lowers himself to look on the heavens and the earth. Our God is not in heaven. Our God is not in earth. God is everything and everywhere, because God is above the limitation of being higher or being lower. Okay, so let us conclude, okay? Let us conclude. So in our framework, greatness goes with transcendence. In God's framework, God is beyond greatness and transcendence. And so God is beyond, yet intimately involved with the universe. Whoa, there we go. And God is relevant. And God is the reality of everything. So what we learned is that God is greater than the conventional understanding of great. And he's beyond any definition or understanding, which is the true definition of infinite. And God is, because he transcends even transcendence, he's intimately involved with and directs every aspect of creation. So here's a question we're going to conclude with. Okay? Does our newfound understanding of God resolve any of the issues people have with God? If yes, which ones? Well, if we focus on what God is and not the packaging, it's much easier to believe in God. However, it raises new questions. If God, in fact, is relevant and is involved in everything that we do, that raises a lot of the classic questions that we asked in the beginning of the class. One thing is, okay, God is proud of me when maybe I do something that's appropriate or that's proper. But if God is one, if God is the reality of everything, then when I'm doing something, when there's suffering in the world, that means that God's engaged in that. And that raises a major question, amongst the many other questions we had. But here's a few last points I want to bring out. And that is, when we ask, is God relevant or not? If God is the truest reality, and I am not in touch with reality, that's a problem. When I am in touch with reality, that's what we call stable. And that's the reason why, although this still may be in a philosophical state right now, and on the practical, we don't see this practically yet. Next week, we're going to have a much more practical class. But we see why it's so fundamentally important in Judaism for one to believe in God. Not because God has a complex, but because the best way to go through life is being in touch with reality, not out of touch with reality. If God is so great, can he possibly need me? That's a great question. We're going to discuss it actually next week. And what's with all the evil and suffering? These are the questions that come out of a relevant God.